Hi everyone, my name is Lindsay Noble and I'm excited to share our research on Gen Z that we conducted at Buzzfeed. And we're really excited to share this research because I think it's a generation that is a massive opportunity and it's also a global study, which we're really proud of. So at Buzzfeed, we define Generation Z as those between the ages of 8 and 22 years old. And they're actually the largest generation ever, comprising 30% of the world's global population, and globally there are almost 2 billion of them. So this generation is definitely a massive group and a massive opportunity for brands and publishers and marketers if you can get it right, which is certainly what made this generation so appealing to BuzzFeed. And we wanted to use this research to develop a really strong, unique point of view on Generation Z. And what we found is that this is a really diverse generation, which is probably not surprising based on the size, but their through line is really that they're commonly uncommon. So the challenge is, how do you reach a disparate, large generation? And what we found is that there are three things that really connect this generation: empathy, truth, and creation. And that's what we're going to focus on today in this presentation. So first, really high level, just want to share the methodology to, again, highlight that this was a global study and also that we really did our homework. So you'll see we used a mixed methodology approach, conducting research in person, as well as quantitative study online, doing video ethnographies, a global community, and a research road trip and high school immersion. So definitely, again, a really in-depth global research study. So I think we want to kick this off by highlighting one of the largest misconceptions about Generation Z. And what we found is that there is many misconceptions about this generation, and they are vocal about the fact that many other generations don't understand them or get things about them wrong. So I think the biggest misconception we found is that millennials and Gen Zs are very similar, or put another way, Gen Zs are millennials on steroids. And we found that any brand or media company who thinks this is really going to be in trouble, because the generations are actually quite different, and Gen Zs tend to have more in common with older generations. So here we have a really fun example from pop culture to just highlight these generational differences. We have two pop icons who do have things in common. They're both Grammy winners, and Taylor Swift was previously the youngest Grammy winner until that was overtaken by Billie Eilish for solo artist. So I think, again, some things in common, but just looking at them aesthetically, there's a lot that's different about these two women and these two generations. So we have Taylor Swift, who is really the millennial pop icon. Aesthetically, we see she's bright and blonde and bubbly. She always traveled with her squad or her pack, and that was something that millennials really embraced as well. How do I put my best face forward and highlight, my squad and my pack and this group mentality? On the right, we have Billie Eilish, who has emerged as a favorite among Gen Zs. And again, we see aesthetically, she's very different. She's definitely a little bit darker, more independent, doesn't feel the need to have that squad around her, doesn't feel the need to wear form-fitting clothing because that's what's expected of her. So again, just highlighting that these two generations are very different. And we spoke a little bit at this on the onset of the research. What we found is that this generation is so niche and they don't feel the need to belong to a pact. And they would actually connect over the fact that difference is their strongest similarity. So not only are they different from millennials, they're also different from each other. We have some really great quotes here from people we spoke to during our research road trip. Everyone featured in this deck is someone that we spoke to in person. So here we have Kate in LA, really great quote here: "My generation is all about quirky culture." So again, this generation is really embracing their individuality, embracing their niche passions, and they don't feel the need to fall into those traditional buckets or to fit in with a pact. In fact, we found that 2/3 of global Zs agree that gender, race, and sexuality all exist on a spectrum. So again, those traditional demographics that were used to define previous generations don't apply to this generation. I think a perfect example we see on that is there's now, or at the time of this research, there was actually 71 gender identities on Facebook. So again, they don't have to fit into those 2 or 3 gender buckets. They really do have leeway to define themselves in the way that they want to. So again, the challenge is, how do we reach a generation that's so unique and different? And that's where we really wanted to focus in on what are 3 things that unite this generation. And that's where we came up with this idea of Generation ETC: empathy, truth, and creation. So first, the empathy in ETC, or the E in ETC, stands for empathy. And we see that after a decade dominated by Instagram ideals and Pinterest perfect, again, those millennials and other previous generations who were putting their sort of best face forward on social, we see that Generation Zs are really letting their guard down and tuning into their emotional and well-being. I think if you think about all the things that this generation has had to encounter or tackle at such a young age, it's probably not surprising that they really are prioritizing their emotional and mental health, as well as things like self-care, and ways, again, that they can really prioritize being the strongest version of themselves. In fact, we found that mental health was the top issue facing global Zs, and 55% agree that everyone should go to therapy. So again, this generation wants to break down those stigmas around mental health. They want it to be okay to talk about the struggles that you're facing, or even just as simply as, I'm having a bad day. Again, they don't feel like they need to put that perfect selfie on Instagram. If they're having a bad day, that's what they will share. And they talk openly with their peers about therapy. In fact, in one of our focus groups, it actually came up totally unaided. So again, they're really open to talking about mental health, talking about their struggles, and making it okay, really, to be not okay. Here we have a really powerful image from our research road trip during Suicide Prevention Week. And we see that posted on the locker on the right. They were putting these really nice positive statements out there to really, again, just show support to each other during an important week that highlights mental health and taking care of your mental health. The post-it said things like, "You are beautiful, you are loved." So again, they really are a generation that's coming together to support each other by showing that empathy and prioritizing their mental health. Again, I think when brands or marketers may think about mental health, it's certainly, an area where you do want to make sure that people are getting help from experts when they need it. But there is a lighter touch way to also connect with this generation. We see that 40% have sought therapy from digital sources like websites, social medias, and apps. So again, something like posting a positive affirmation on your Instagram account is a really great way to show this generation that you're empathetic and you're thinking about your audience's mental health. So again, just another way to think about this sort of light touch way to dive into empathy. Next, we get to the T in ETC, truth, which is another pillar that connects Generation Z. Again, I think it's always important when thinking about this generation, so those 8 to 22, for the purpose of this research, 13 to 22, what have they grown up with? So this generation grew up in an era of fake news. I know I'm a millennial. I had not heard of fake news, when I was 13, certainly. So again, thinking of that makes them really truth seeking, and they want to find out what's real in culture, but also what's real in themselves. So again, thinking of their age, they really are sort of carving their own path and their own identity. So they're seeking 2 things, truth in culture and also truth in themselves. 75% of them agree that they never trust things at face value. They do their own research. So again, they feel really empowered to find the truth. They feel like it's an opportunity for them to utilize all the sources at their disposal to get to the bottom of what's true, both in culture and for them. And we find, especially during this time of COVID, they tend to be even more truth seeking. They're having trouble discerning what's true and what's false in all the news and media coverage. And they're really looking to news and content sources to provide coverage around the biggest lies and myths. So another way you can think about timely way to connect with this generation on truth. Here we have Nesma, who we spoke to in New York, and she had a really great quote about what truth means to her. She was 22, she had just graduated college and was starting her career, and she said, "Truth to me is about finding a path through the clutter of information that is presented to us to find out the facts of what's really going on." So again, this generation is really truth seeking. 7 in 10 agree that their generation is taking bigger steps to uncovering the truth. So again, they certainly could see this this as a burden. I know we talk a lot about the overwhelmingness of sources that you have available to you and how there's so many to dig through, but they actually really see it as an opportunity. Again, we see a quote here that really speaks to that, to challenge the status quo, get to the bottom of what's true, and figure out who they trust, which is, I think, is an important thing to also think about as a brand or a publisher or marketer. How do you get to be one of those trusted sources? And finally, getting to the C in ETC, we have creation. And I think thinking about Gen Zs, they're not just creatives, they're actually creators. So outside of creating creative things like art and photography, which they're certainly doing, they're thinking about how they can use their creativity to rebuild culture from the ground up. So again, thinking about all these things they grew up with, many feel like things in society at large or social institutions are broken or don't apply to them anymore. 90% of global Zs that we spoke to said that at least one major social institution, so things like gender-specific clothing, 9-to-5 jobs, 4-year college, was important to previous generations, but it no longer applies to them. So when they're thinking about how do I challenge the status quo, they're thinking about how they can do things outside the box and really what they can do to fix things they feel like are broken in culture. I think a perfect example, we see another key issue among this generation is climate change. And we've seen the activism and the creativity in activism that this generation has brought to hopefully help address that issue. We have Max Pixard on this slide here, 16-year-old in Brooklyn, New York, who showed his creativity by actually making pants. That was one of his hobbies. So again, thinking about another way, don't jump to misconceptions about this generation. During the day of our interview, he had actually just sold his first pair of pants. So just highlights, again, another way to use creativity and entrepreneurial spirit in the same way. And finally, we have some great quotes here that show how they are going beyond just being creative to use their creativity to carve out their own future and how they can hopefully take steps to make culture better for next generations as well. So I think Anna in Davis, California really said it best. We are a generation that has been tasked with a crumbling status quo. There's a terror to that, but I also think my generation has taken it as an opportunity to say, screw the rules. So I think that's another really important thing we're seeing with this generation is that they are positive and optimistic about the things facing them. So certainly it would be easy for them to be overwhelmed, but they're seeing it as an opportunity. Same with what we see in truth. How do I get to the bottom of truth? How do I use my creativity and my entrepreneurial spirit to really improve culture and make my mark on the world? So again, they're a very large, disparate generation, which creates challenges for brands, but based on their size, there's also a huge opportunity to reach this generation and get your messaging right. And that can be done by leaning into these three key things: empathy, truth, and creation. I think here we have a really great summary of what this means for brands and marketers and publishers. The E, empathy. This generation is looking for brands that are made with love, brands that are inclusive, and brands that connect over their difference and really highlight how this generation is prioritizing their emotional and mental health. I think a perfect example we heard about empathy was the brand Fenty. So it was a brand that respondents really felt like was made with love because it was so inclusive. So a makeup company that launched with a ton of different shades, many more than any others, to again recognize that people are different and everyone's looking for something different to address their needs. Truth, and this generation is truth seeking. They're doing their part to uncover the truth and they don't trust things at face value. What that means is they really want unbiased information from brands and marketers and publishers. They want those brands and marketers and publishers to really help them intensify their knowledge of the world and what truth is for them. I think one brand we heard that come to mind a lot in truth is Billy, which launched as a direct-to-consumer razor brand. And a razor, the point of a razor for most, is to get rid of unwanted body hair. So their advertising and marketing campaigns showed women with unwanted body hair or with body hair. And I think that's, again, just showing a simple way where they're not covering up, the truth of why you use a razor. Like they're really speaking to that and putting that in the forefront of their marketing and advertising campaigns. And finally, we have the C, creation. More than just the creative process, Gen Zs are really thinking about how they can rebuild culture, and they're looking for brands that are also on the cultural front line. We heard a lot about Depop, which is an online thrifting mobile platform that allowed consumers to be creative and highlighted also something that they're really interested in, which is thrifting, which I think has larger impacts on just, getting new clothes. They're also thinking about like sustainability and things like that, which goes along the lines of how they can be creative and make a positive mark on the world. So I know that was a lot of information at a short time, and I'm excited to tackle any questions that may come your way, but I'm hoping that through this presentation, you feel like you learned a thing or two about Gen Zs and how to reach this large, disparate generation.